access to education, etc. It would be easy enough if we just stopped there to talk about flood risk today, but as the title also mentions, we're looking at flood risk in the future, which means we have to consider changes to the hazard, increasing sea level, raising sea levels, or increasing frequency of floods from the rivers. We have to think about population growth and urban development, and we need to think of other changes as well to this equation. But ultimately, through the years, we have developed models in the scientific community to assess this risk, to look at all of these different combinations of hazard and exposure information and vulnerability trends. However, it goes with saying that these outputs from these global models have some critical limitations that existed at the beginning of my research. For example, a lot of these global models were focused mainly on solutions to flood risk that involved structural measures, namely dikes and levees, or DL, listed here. They also really took an economic approach, looking at benefits and costs strictly from a monetary point of view, and maybe didn't expand into other realms that are equally important. If they were considering nature-based solutions, which are a growing trend in the world of disaster risk reduction, they were really taken in a limited angle, a limited perspective, not really incorporating the full picture of nature-based solutions. And because they're originally developed by scientists, maybe sometimes we're missing other perspectives outside of the scientific community. So all of that goes to say that these gaps need to be met. And this guided my question that I wanted to ultimately use as the aim of my thesis, of my book, essentially to strengthen our community's understanding of global flood risk reduction. And the main ways that I propose to expand this understanding is by incorporating additional disaster risk reductions measures, as well as equity concerns across different societal groups and geographical regions in the world. Some of these questions that I'll leave up here for you to read while I go through a brief summary. Essentially, we want to look at what kinds of changes are occurring between now and the end of the 21st century. We want to look at what options do we have to reduce these risks that are changing, both structural and non-structural. I wanted to really also look at nature-based solutions and see if we could expand the current perspective that we were using to quantify those benefits. And of course, last but not least, thinking about the marginalized communities that have been excluded from these decision-making processes when talking about flood risk reduction. As you might have noticed, there was a color coding there, and these colors here on this figure translate to each chapter's aim for answering these questions. So in chapter 2, I've answered 3 of these questions. In chapter 4, I've answered 2 of these questions, etc. Today, I won't be going through the specifics of my chapters. This will be with my committee. But instead, I'd like to tell you some of the answers that I found in very plain and basic terms to the questions that I just introduced. It goes to the point of saying by the end of the 21st century, we are experiencing large increases to flood risk without any action. We're talking orders of magnitude increases. For example, expected annual damages, the monetary risk, could increase from the scale of billions to trillions every year. And if we're talking about the people exposed to flood risk, that's in the range of millions to tens of millions, and sometimes even hundreds of millions. Unfortunately, certain areas in the world will be experiencing more impacts, more severe impacts than others. This is especially relevant in South Asia, East Asia and the Pacific, as well as Sub-Saharan Africa, areas which we estimate that have low existing risk reduction or risk protection standards. This is something that would need to be increased. This is exactly what we explored with the second question of the thesis. And to varying degrees of success, we have options that we can talk about. Dikes and levees, for example, as mentioned, do have strong performance in reducing flood risk monetarily, but with some costs that need to be considered as well when you talk about operation and maintenance. Other options that I explored include nature-based solutions, zoning restrictions, and flood proofing, specifically dry proofing, where you take a building and protect it from floodwaters as they come in. Ultimately, it depends on the context of where we're talking about. For example, zoning restrictions work very well in areas projected to urbanize greatly. whereas dry proofing measures work well in existing urbanized settings. But carefully, we must consider the metrics that we are using to decide which solution we go forward with. Being cost effective does not mean that you are achieving a goal of flood risk reduction or any other goal for that matter that might be important to something such as the Sustainable Development Goals. And so this is something that I really explored in chapter 3 of the thesis, but also touched on in the end in my synthesis, which I'll get to in just a moment. The third question, with nature-based solutions, they do have some impact in reducing flood risk. Granted, not as much as dikes and levees or dry proofing, but they do have the opportunity to enrich coastal communities, especially small coastal communities. The perspective today is that much of our energy and time is being focused on developing nature-based solutions in urban areas while neglecting the needs of rural coastal communities that also could benefit from nature-based solutions. Some of these contributions to people include agricultural and aquaculture output increases, as well as opportunities for employment and ecotourism. This is something that I explored in depth in chapter 4 of my thesis. And finally, rural communities, sexual and gender minorities, and other social groups have been marginalized, excluded, not explicitly mentioned through the years, these past decades of disaster risk reduction, but there are ways that we can include them moving forward. This includes talking about them, acknowledging these communities and their needs. It means going to the United Nations level or the World Bank level and explicitly incorporating their specific social vulnerabilities into future modeling efforts. It means accounting for some of these nature contributions to people that aren't necessarily straightforward monetary contributions. These are all options that we have and that I explored in the final 2 technical chapters of my thesis. Moving forward from the corpus that I present today, there are 3 other ways that I think we could really improve future flood risk modeling. This includes expanding our current portfolio, if you will, of flood risk reduction options. So on the screen, you'll see the DL, remember dikes and levees, but also zoning restrictions, dry proofing, nature-based solutions. This is currently existing within the same modeling framework, but why not off to the right include something like managed retreat, where we really focus on altering existing exposure, or early warning systems, which would help us reduce vulnerability. Also relevant is incorporating adaptation solution hybridization, using 2 solutions at once to see if there are any additional benefits that could be raised. And also looking at the evaluation metrics, as I mentioned. Do we strictly go forward with our benefit cost analyses, only looking at monetary values, or can we expand them into environmental, social values, et cetera? Secondly, I think we can enhance our flood risk modeling efforts by incorporating dynamic data. In my research already, I looked at increasing sea level rise and other hazard changes, as well as population growth. But why not look at different areas of growth outside of these defined urban centers, or think about some of the changes that could come with vulnerability? I think this is a huge area for improvement that will be accomplished within the next decade or so. And finally, we could elevate the impact of these risk frameworks by incorporating other modeling approaches and perspectives to this decision-making table. Thinking about what a community needs in the United States is not the same as a community in the Netherlands or in Ghana or in Indonesia. I think this is something that we are already making steps towards as a society, but when it comes to specifically incorporating these into global flood risk models, there is still a long way to go. And I really wanted today to not be the boogeyman to say that these issues are barriers that we cannot overcome. I hope that the book that I've published through my thesis is more of a testament that we can all look back to in several decades as something that we have overcome, the challenges that we've overcome. But the key to this success is by doing this as the whole of society, thinking not just about flood risk reduction for a city or for a specific country, but thinking about flood risk reduction, disaster risk reduction for all. And with that, I would really love to thank you all for your attention. Thank you online again for coming in early in the morning, late in the evening. Thank you so much, everybody. And I return the floor to the committee.
Well, thank you for your clear and interesting presentation. May I hear if the candidate is prepared to defend the thesis?
Director, on your authority and as authorized by the College of Deans and according to the decision of the Dean of the Faculty of Science, I am indeed prepared to defend my thesis entitled Preparing for Future Flood Risk Now, an Expanded Understanding of Forward-Looking Disaster Risk Reduction in the Face of Increasing Coastal and Riverine Flood Risk.
Okay, excellent. Then I would like to invite first colleague, Professor Kees Boersma, Professor of Innovation in Crisis Management and Social Resilience, Faculty of Social Science and Humanities of this university, to start the opposition.
Thank you. On the authority of the rector and by virtue of my right, dear candidate, first of all, I would like to congratulate you with a really nice, thoughtful and well-written thesis. Certainly you are ready to defend. Reading through all the chapters, I was impressed about the work that you did and also the wide variety of the topics that you are able to address. And I think your research is helpful in the hands of researchers interested in DRR, like myself, but from a social sciences perspective, natural-based solutions and vulnerability assessments, but also in the hands of policymakers. So I hope that they will also read your book. Because you're right that setting priorities for measures regarding flood risk is a major challenge and it will only increase in the future. In the chapters 4 and 5, you make a strong argument for the need to involve local stakeholders and communities in the implementation of solutions and even in involving them in decision-making processes. And that makes you also a truly engaged scholar. Huh? You pay attention to social vulnerability, in particular in chapter 5, where you ask for a human rights approach in DRR in order to include the LGBTQ+ community in assessment frameworks. Intersectional dynamics, particularly regarding various forms of discrimination, racism, and transphobia, make indeed people vulnerable potentially. However, my question concerns the agency of that community. In your introduction speech, you talk about, hey, we have to talk about them. But then I'm curious, what is their agency? So that's my question, but I will a little bit introduce and then ask my question. Throughout histories of marginalization, the LGBTQ+ communities have developed collective strategies of resistance. They possess a strong mobilization capacity, and by drawing on their social capital, they use their informal networks and their grassroots movements, right, to create spaces of survival. And that, I think, is an interesting asset, potentially really interesting asset also in the context of disaster. So that will be my question. And it might go a little bit beyond the data that you collected, but hey, given you're being knowledgeable in this field, I'm curious about what you have to say. So while the LGBTQ+ community is indeed often vulnerable and more vulnerable than others, how do you view their agency? And in your call for the human rights, do you also consider their strategies of resistance to be an asset in DRR strategies?
Dear learned opponent, thank you for your kind words regarding my thesis and for the very stimulating question in two parts. First, I think the agency that sexual and gender minorities have is real. And going through the preparations of paper number 5, I found a couple of encouraging examples in specific disasters of specific communities within the LGBT umbrella having formed these networks together. For example, chosen families in neighborhoods coming together and providing resources that others might not have had. But quite discouragingly, I found a lot of discrimination as well. Even if you do have a chosen family or a really rich social network, what if you need to go to a center, a shelter, which is strictly limited in terms of binary? And if we're talking about a large-scale disaster, a large-scale flood, maybe everybody in your chosen family has also been impacted, and therefore you must depend on these resources that are being provided through the local and regional governments. And so this is what I was really thinking about when I was talking about incorporating the LGBT perspective. Of course, I have much confidence in the community to provide for their members, but when we're talking about governments and how they respond, sometimes you may be in a political system that only partially recognizes your existence, or maybe doesn't even at all. And this is what I think was really important moving into the second portion of the question. With the facts of the matter, in the paper, I really tried to focus on regions and not specific countries or specific subnational areas. But it is quite discouraging to see how some countries might not even acknowledge or have protections for trans, gay, etc. And through my work, I was able to find that tens of millions of people are living in countries like this. The purpose of the paper was not specifically to point to a country and shame or say, you need to change. It's just a matter of fact that these places exist, which is why I think international efforts to reduce disaster risk have a real potential to use the leverage of having a whole of society perspective. You still have, or you have quite a few initiatives coming out of the United Nations. I'm thinking of the United Nations Women's Organization that is really trying to increase the visibility and inclusion of these segments of society. My call is simply to expand that inclusion.
If I have time for a follow-up, Rector?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, so, yeah, thank you. And I see indeed also the dark side. At the same time, you are also arguing, hey, let's include them more than now in decision-making processes. So that's really an active form of being involved. Huh? So, and there is also an idea about, let's say, the co-creation and co-construction of those knowledge that feeds into the decision-making processes. So, and maybe they shouldn't be always on the table directly. So do you see opportunities then still to recognize their agency in actual decision-making processes? Or is it, hey, we have to listen to their voices and then we include their voices in the assessments that we do?
If I'm making the selection of one or the other, I would probably go with the latter. And this doesn't just go for the LGBT community. This is also for rural communities as well. And that's what the nuance that I really tried to lay out in chapter 6. By hearing these voices and including them, that's already a starting point. If it gets to something as involved as giving full autonomy to rural organizations or LGBT organizations to provide resources for their own community members, that's wonderful. But that shouldn't be the only solution. It should be part of a robust, highly redundant system that is providing safety nets from multiple angles. Not to completely neglect the agency that they have, but to say that it shouldn't be the only solution.
Right. No, thank you.
Yeah.
So once again, I hope that the policymakers will read your thesis. Thanks.
Thank you.
And then I would like to invite Professor Paul Block, Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering, College of Engineering, University of Wisconsin-Madison in the USA, to continue the opposition. So thank you for taking part in this committee, Professor Block.
Thank you,
Can we
Mr.
please
Rector.
get him on the screen?
Thank you, Mr. Rector. And on the authority of the Rector and by virtue of my rights, I congratulate you, candidate, on reaching this important milestone. So well done. I think you have certainly made some important advancements across science, both physical and science and social perspectives. I'm going to move more directly to the questions, however. So I have a number of questions that I'd like to get some of your feedback on. The first one is around this idea of defining benefits of your protective measures. You do a nice job of acknowledging that this is difficult. It's really difficult to adequately determine them well, and particularly because many of these benefits might be indirect. So there are some within the disaster risk reduction and anticipatory action communities that are moving away from these ideas of trying to holistically and exhaustively define the benefits and the benefit cost ratios that go around with those, because they can be highly uncertain. Costs, perhaps less so. So layer that on top of looking at many different flood types, coastal, riverine, etc. How confident are you in how well you have defined benefits? And do you need to be exhaustive in defining these benefits? And is that even your main motivation? And then I'll have a follow-up after that.
Dear learned opponent, thank you for your kind, brief words and your question as well that I find very interesting through the years in my development of the first 2 technical chapters of this thesis. Really, my personal opinion should be separate from my professional opinion, of course. However, I think it's high time that we take the human approach of looking at expected annual affected population, or in the book as I call it, EAAP, the number of people impacted by this disaster, as opposed to the more traditionally accepted EAD, expected annual damages. Granted, decision makers, engineers, project planners need to have some sort of budgetary information to point to the person writing the check to say we are paying for this solution. But ultimately, I think it's high time that we take a human approach, which is why in the last paper, the technical chapter specifically, I only kept it to EAAP. That's not to say that we can't continue to explore how to incorporate other benefits, such as these nature contributions to people that I mentioned. But really, it walks a fine line monetizing cultural value, the cultural value of a community, or the environmental value of this ecosystem. In the technical chapter on the resilient rural communities, there are some examples where you can look at the increased output and say this nature-based solution has resulted in this benefit. So I think we could continue exploring this way, but ultimately we need to be thinking of people and not the bottom line financially, in my opinion, which I'm sure you will have a follow-up question about.
Yeah, thank you. I very much appreciate that. I do want to ask another question along these lines, and then time permitting, move to the more social human dimensions if we have time. So you definitely highlight some of the drawbacks and the overuse of benefit cost ratios, and I appreciate that. However, you include it as for the reasons that you just stated, and do some nice comparison with another metric, an efficacy metric. One question that I will ask, but follow on before your response is, are there other better metrics? These 2 metrics perhaps oftentimes disagree. So, for example, the state that I live in Wisconsin, one of the recommendations is dikes and levees, and the state directly next to us, Minnesota, the recommendation is for dry proofing. Yet, if you zoom out very far, most would agree that these 2 states have lots of similar features, yet the recommendation, perhaps that's too strong of a word, the outcome is quite different. From your other metric, they look more the same. So I guess my question is, what really drives what is selected here? What are the features that are most important in controlling whether dry proofing or dikes or levees are selected? And why can it be so different in 2 regions that are very proximal to each other?
I really appreciate this question. It gives me a chance to explain a little bit more this efficacy metric that I developed. Essentially, what I was trying to communicate through my papers was that instead of saying every region needs to be at the same flood protection standard or every region needs to conform to one another, I followed a relative risk approach, which took the proportion of these expected annual damages to GDP and held them constant through the entire time series of my study, in this case, to the end of the 21st century. And so what that resulted in was quite often, as you mentioned, this discrepancy between a traditional benefit cost ratio as well as this efficacy metric, or how well can you achieve this risk reduction goal that is being set by this ratio. And ultimately, you come into some very interesting cases. One, as you mentioned, Minnesota and Wisconsin, but quite often where you have seemingly identical, perhaps, regions having varied results. And I think that just goes to show that there are improvements, of course, to be made to this efficacy metric. And perhaps it involves looking at these sustainable development goals that are about to be renewed for another 15 years and seeing how we can incorporate some of these criteria that they are discussing into how we're ultimately ranking all of these options to make a better informed engineering decision.
Very, very good. Thank you. Mr. Rector, do I have time for one more question?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So I wanted to ask a question about Social Vulnerability Index, SOVI Index. SOVI Index are classically developed based on census data, which is oftentimes readily available and pairing socioeconomic data and all these types of things. However, I would argue that there are some deficiencies with this, or some drawbacks is maybe a better word. And one of them, I believe, is that we oftentimes don't get an adequate or proper representation of the community's perceptions. So this might be able to be done through surveys, other means in which you could get some of the perceptions of preparedness, the perceptions of risk from the community, as opposed to the typical way, which it is more top-down or outside perspective. If you had this kind of information available, risk perception, preparedness levels, et cetera, from a community perspective, would that in any way change the modeling efforts that you do, any of the decision strategies, or would the outcomes be the same?
I think it certainly would change the modeling approach if you had such highly detailed information regarding preferences, perspectives, understanding of flood risk. If you had this rich of a data set, I would recommend immediately developing something along the lines of an agent-based model, for example, where you could really capture some of these personal and interpersonal dynamics. Unfortunately, what I ran into with my research and the outcomes that I was going for was that this would indeed require an extensive amount of survey collecting and information grabbing, which colleagues here at the university and around the world are undertaking. But I made the choice at that time when I was developing these two technical chapters relating to global flood risk modeling to not go down this avenue. But indeed, this sort of information would be highly relevant in an alternative modeling approach.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you for the answer to these questions, and congratulations again. I'm finished with my questions, Mr. Rector.
Okay, thank you for the interesting debate. Then next I would like to invite Professor Heidi Kreibich, Professor of Flood Risk and Climate Adaptation at GFZ Helmut Center for Geoscience and the Geography Department at Humboldt Universität Berlin, to continue the opposition. So thank you for taking part in this committee, Professor Kreibich. She's there online, so please get her on the screen for us.
Thank you, Mr. Rector. On the authority of the Rector and by virtue of my right, dear candidate, I thank you very much for your very informative talk, and I congratulate you very much for the interesting results you presented in your thesis, I think which are of very high value for the scientific community, but also highly relevant for our society. And not our society here in Europe, but worldwide. So I thank you very much, and congratulations again. So I also want to directly jump into the questions. And to start off, I have a little bit of a quite general strategic question. So I would claim that the scale at which flood protection or other management measures are implemented is rather local to subnational scale. Additionally, particularly for flood risk assessments, 30 meters more left or more right can make a big difference for a building to be located in an inundation area or in a floodplain or outside. So in your chapter where you talk about global riverine flood risk, chapter 3.2, you talk about the risk components and that you use a flood hazard model with a resolution of 30 arc seconds, which is 1 kilometer at the equator. Thus, my strategic question is, so why did you assess flood risk and adaptation options on the global scale? So what do you think are the advantages of this approach and what are the shortcomings?
Dear learned opponent, thank you for your kind words about the thesis as well as this question about a very relevant topic that gave me a lot of lost nights of sleep, honestly. This specific study that you mentioned, the riverine flood risk modeling, originally was intended to take a different form, and ultimately I was grateful to have access to this hazard data set that I used that you mentioned was 30 arc seconds in resolution. However, indeed, if you're looking at some urban communities, you are making huge assumptions in this expansion of the river floodplain, when in reality, some of these riverine flood impacts are dictated on the order of the width of a street, depending on whether you will flood or not. And so this is definitely a shortcoming of the riverine flood risk study, and in general, perhaps studies that are using coarse data sets. However, I would really strongly argue that this sort of global risk reduction assessment, if you will, is valuable in that we can use the results to prioritize regions to invest more focus in more detailed studies. So for example, if you are looking on the subnational scale as I do, and see that you have 3 specific areas along a certain river valley of 3 major river systems in a country, you could then move to the next phase of a study where you focus on this watershed specifically to conduct further, more detailed modeling. And this is something that I would really like to mention, that this book is incredibly useful, I believe, but it cannot serve as the go-to answer for a local scale assessment. A global scale study such as this makes far too many assumptions and assumes homogeneous conditions beyond what I would feel comfortable recommending to a local scale assessment.
Thank you very much. Maybe just a very quick follow-up question to that. So what would you then think, for which decisions is this global, rather coarse assessment helpful, and who would be your stakeholders?
And when you say decisions, are you talking about the specific disaster risk reduction measures, or more broadly speaking, planning and
including the
strategizing?
planning, yes, including planning and strategic decisions.
I understand. I believe this sort of assessment with this coarse resolution might be more relevant in something along the lines of prescribing zoning restrictions, as opposed to something that's highly asset-based, such as dry proofing, and maybe even to a certain extent, dikes and levees. But in general, I think this could be very relevant, excuse me, this could be very relevant when you're talking about strategizing on a regional and national scale, which oftentimes is the origin point of the funds that are further distributed into the subnational and local scale. With that being said, you have private partners that are involved as well, and having these sorts of assessments existing before the private entities are also involved could help expedite their processes as well. Which is also a valuable contribution, I believe, in the strategy planning.
Okay, thank you very much. Great answer. Now I want to come to 2 very specific methodological questions. And as my background is indeed this riverine flood risk modeling, I stick to the same chapter and to the same study. So in this same chapter 3.2, you also describe that you use deterministic, and I would call them rather old-fashioned depth damage curves for the flood damage modeling, while since maybe a decade, modern damage models are describing the damage processes better via multivariable approaches and, to my understanding, very importantly, probabilistic approaches, which would inherently quantify the quite high uncertainties which are associated with damage modeling. So why did you use your approach, and what are the consequences of this decision?
We used this approach because there was a very detailed study by Hausinga in 2018, I believe, indeed 2018, that looked at a variety of vulnerability curves in various national contexts throughout the world. And this, at that moment when we were developing these studies, was readily available and really handy to use. Granted, some of these curves only describe certain countries. They certainly don't describe every country or every subnational region in the world, where I believe, as you mentioned, some of these probabilistic approaches incorporating multiple variables would be relevant. But for the purposes of our study, that didn't really seem, the effort that would be required to collect and incorporate all of that information didn't necessarily merit to the scope of the study. So it is a valid point that you raise, and I encourage this to be investigated further in the future as well.
Okay, thank you. Then my next question fits rather well to that, because yeah, I believe that modeling is very useful and the results can be used a lot, but every model is associated with uncertainty, and in unlucky cases also with bias, which then reduces a lot the value of the results. Now, if you introduce a certain bias into your modeling approach. Therefore, I would like to ask you, how rigorously did you validate your modeling approach, and yeah, what is really the uncertainty which is associated with your approach? How can you be sure that your results are reasonable and not associated with significant bias?
As far as validating the methodology goes, my papers specifically don't explore this in depth, but there is a rich lineage preceding my technical papers, ranging all the way from Vicemius, Ward, through Jungmann and Tegeloven as well, that have gone through rigorous steps to validate this methodology. So I will stand very firmly on the method itself. But when you're talking about the uncertainty that's involved with incorporating these global data sets, indeed, you will have many things that that pop up that give pause. I think uncertainty is a part of any modeling approach, and I feel that we went through decent steps to look at the weight, excuse me, of these assumptions and the uncertainty they introduced, compared to the benefit of expediting this modeling activity exercise.
Maybe also more a strategic question then, because if I understand you correctly, you cannot give an indication about how high the uncertainties are with your results. What do you see in terms of their usability then for decision making? I mean, this is now a more philosophical question. Would you
Sure.
think that a better informed decision could be taken if also the decision makers would be informed about the amount of uncertainty, or at least be aware of uncertainty bounds associated with such results?
I would certainly advocate for being transparent with the existing uncertainties if you are presenting this to a decision maker, for example. And this helps build in safety factors and build emergency action plans. So this information shouldn't be neglected completely. And if you're looking at my first two chapters in the technical portion of the book, I do include a range of potential values for monetary damages and people impacted by using different combinations of SSPs and RCPs, which themselves also have sources of uncertainty that are being combined in this risk framework. Do I think it would be worthwhile to include this range of values as well as uncertainty bounds? and give all of this information to a decision maker, or maybe simplify the information so that they can make an informed but rapid decision in how they choose to reduce disaster risk in their region. I won't answer for each decision maker, but I would tend to think that a clear, simple message would be more handy.
Okay, thank you. So I'm at the end of my questions and would hand over to the next opponent. Thank you. Back to the Mr. Rector.
Thank you, Professor Kreibeek, for these insightful questions. So then next I would like to invite Dr. Gundula Winter, Senior Researcher, Coastal Flood Risk Management and Adaptive Planning at Deltares, to continue the opposition. Thank you very much for being here to participate in this committee. Dr. Winter.
Yeah, on the authority of the rector and by virtue of my right, first of all, I want to congratulate you on this extensive work and finalizing your thesis. I think it's very important work. I think it comes very timely to look beyond the flood risk and also quantify the potential of different types of flood risk reduction measures. And that brings me immediately to my first question. You included also nature-based solutions, namely foreshore vegetation, in the global assessment of coastal flood risk reduction. I think this is a very important contribution, not just to the body of science, but also because nature-based solutions are central to the European mission on climate adaptation. They play a huge role in the Sustainable Development Goals and other global frameworks. And this is because nature-based solutions also bring a lot of co-benefits. However, many ecosystems are under threat from climate change themselves. How would you rate the risk that nature-based solutions will not perform anymore under future conditions? Do you think there is a risk when these global frameworks push heavily for nature-based solutions? And maybe lastly, do you think you could include this in your models, kind of as another layer of uncertainty that my previous opponent already dwelled upon?
Dear learned opponent, thank you for your kind words on the thesis, as well as this quite scary question, honestly. When it comes to sea level rise and its impact on the landscapes that we're a part of, humans and assets aren't only impacted, the environment is impacted as well. And when you're relying on nature-based solutions to provide protection for these people and assets, you don't have this sort of firm certainty that you might have with another structural measure, which already for a decision maker can be concerning. And then when you look into the future of climate change and perhaps the extent of mangrove or salt marshes, as I look, actually potentially reducing. We assume that you can restore all of these areas, but there are climate models that project that some regions might not be habitable for these types of ecosystems, which is alarming. I think it is still relevant to include these in decision-making frameworks. And as I mentioned before, not necessarily to point at it as a specific standalone solution, but perhaps in the future explore hybridization, combining a nature-based solution, for example, with a structural measure, so that you didn't have to raise the dike and levee by a certain amount of meters, or instead combine it with the impacts of or the benefits of a nature-based solution. And this goes to the work of Tegeloven that is currently ongoing and hopefully published soon, that I was a part of. But it is indeed scary. But I would merit to you then, what kinds of impacts will climate change have on the effectiveness of a dike and levee? For example, in the Netherlands, with droughts that are happening, some of these dikes and levees that have stood the test of time for hundreds of years have all of a sudden dried out and fail. So this is something that I think needs to be considered in every adaptation measure that we're considering. But indeed, it is a very pressing issue.
Yeah, thank you for also pointing out the uncertainty in the other disaster risk reduction measures. That's not to neglect. Another question that I have concerns adaptive planning. You might be familiar with the concept of adaptation pathways that see adaptation as a sequence of measures. So you have performed the global assessment on coastal flood risk and disaster risk reduction measures for the end of the century. And for that, you concluded dikes are very effective in reaching the same risk targets relative to GDP, while zoning restrictions and nature-based solutions have really good benefit-cost ratios. But climate change and sea level rise are accelerating, particularly in the next century. How do you think the measures you evaluated will perform beyond the end of this century, both in terms of the efficacy and the costs and benefits, or maybe also other metrics that the former opponent has asked you about?
Right. I think this is another very valid concern. Many of my colleagues, including some co-authors, would disagree with my perspective of planning until the end of the 21st century, and they would argue maybe look at the end of the 22nd century, which is possible and being explored by other work. I really, it's quite tricky. Where do you set the goal as far as what you're planning for? A lot of decision makers might be thinking in terms of political cycles or the lifetime that they have left or that of their children. Ultimately, we need to be responding to community needs, and communities are lasting for hundreds of years. So I do agree that perhaps looking at this time frame that ends at the 21st century is a bit short-sighted. But this is where something along the lines of the dynamic adaptive approach comes in handy, because we can look at timelines of decisions and see if we make a decision now, what sorts of negative outcomes can we avoid in the future versus making that exact same decision 20, 30 years in the future, and then therefore restricting our options going forward. So I think DAP from Del Torres really has a role going forward in this kind of work. But as far as the timeframe question, I won't poke to a specific date and say this is where we plan to. I think it's good enough to be thinking of the future already, and I'll leave that debate to policymakers and their constituents.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for bringing also the actions that we can do now, for bringing that up, as that will determine the decisions that will stay open for us in the future. Do you think your global assessment and the modeling framework that you have developed for that could also support this timeline view on adaptation? And do you think you could adapt your framework to address these questions over time?
I think the framework that I present certainly could be adapted to include that approach, perhaps for a subsequent PhD candidate. But I think it would be quite straightforward. Already the work that I've conducted looked at 3 specific timeframes, 2030, 2050, and 2080. And I think it would be quite easy to add a dynamic component to see how much risk reduction has been created by a certain point, and then again, run a modeling process for all of the other alternative disaster risk reduction measures to say, for example, if you wanted to explore hybridization in 2030, 2050, and 2080, as opposed to what I have just proposed of hybridizing in the current moment. So I think it is quite applicable and readily incorporated into this framework.
Thank you. Mr. Rector, do I have time for one more question?
A very short question with a short answer.
Then maybe very short. You have presented the results of your global assessment at the level of the world regions. There's an IPCC report coming up on cities and settlements. Do you think that the data that you produced as part of your study could be used in this upcoming report, or what are the limitations that you would put upon it based on the assumptions that you made and the data that you used?
To put it briefly, yes, I think it should be used, but with well-stated caveats to ensure that people are not taking this book as the Bible of disaster risk reduction and really focusing on these city scale modeling assessments. I would like to elaborate more, but
It's supposed to be short, yeah?
Yeah, it's supposed to be short.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Winter, for the insightful questions. The next, I invite colleague Dr. Marleen de Ruiter, Assistant Professor of Multi-Hazard Risk at the Institute for Environmental Studies of this university, to continue the opposition. Thank you for taking part in this committee. Dr. de Ruiter, the floor is yours.
On the authority of the rector and by virtue of my right, dear candidates, I want to join the others in congratulating you on a very interesting thesis that I read with great joy. In my questions, I would like to mainly focus on Chapter 5, and I also want to thank you for putting this specific topic at the forefront of our field, because I don't think that's been done well enough, so thank you for that. In Chapter 5, you underscore how omitting sexual and gender minorities from flood risk assessments and DRR efforts perpetuates systemic vulnerabilities. In Section 6.2.2, you provide an elaborate discussion about enhancing flood risk assessments by incorporating dynamic multi-hazard exposure and vulnerability data. I would like to take this multi-hazard lens and take it back to Chapter 5. The global flood analysis in Chapter 5 uses the EAAP for coastal and riverine floods separately. How could this approach be extended to compound or cascading hazards for marginalized groups?
Dear learned opponent, thank you for your very kind words, as well as this question that gives me a moment of pause. I really already acknowledge the importance of incorporating this multi-hazard perspective into our risk modeling efforts. But to be frank, I hadn't even considered this for Chapter 5. Chapter 6 came after Chapter 5. But looking at this chapter now and thinking about how we can incorporate the multi-hazard lens, of course, it's relevant to talk about compound flooding and consecutive floods, and also perhaps incorporating other hazards. But really looking at this specifically, I'm not sure if the multi-hazard approach would necessarily change the outcome of these results in the chapter itself. Indeed, the impacts experienced by these individuals in these regions that I explored would be more severe. But I took a quite simplistic approach of saying this person has been impacted. I'm not sure, of course, perhaps more people would be impacted if a compound flood were to occur, or if a flood were to occur immediately after an earthquake. So I would guess these numbers that I present are quite conservative in that regard. But by how much of an increase could we expect? I'm not sure on the scale, actually.
Maybe room for some future research there.
Indeed.
As you know, I'm someone particularly interested in dynamics for vulnerability. So I was a bit surprised to read in Chapter 5 that you wrote, here we hold future vulnerability, i.e. and the GAI and the LEI, constant to current levels. I recognize also the uncertainty that you mentioned both in Chapter 5 and 6 around this topic, but I'm nonetheless interested in kind of seeing your thoughts on what would happen if you combined flood hazard exposure data with with more dynamic vulnerability dynamics that you didn't capture now. So how would it change over time and also spatially?
I really think this is a valid avenue of research that I wanted to include in this chapter. Unfortunately, already these indices describing the experience of sexual and gender minorities is coming with heavy assumptions. They're only presented on the national scale and not looking at subnational units. The Williams Center, which is the source of these indices, has actually collected this information over the past decade and a half, I believe, at least, which allowed me the opportunity to futurecast trends in this dynamic vulnerability to predict which countries might experience higher rates of acceptance and which countries might depreciate. Unfortunately, I think the state of the current world is that these vulnerability dynamics are too volatile, at least to include in this sort of study. But I do think they have a place in a future study, and certainly are being explored by my colleagues at the Williams Center and around the world as well.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rector, do I have time for one more final question?
Yes.
So as both of us know, dear candidate, the global and long-standing expert in the field of social vulnerability is Susan Cutter. And I know from working and teaching with you how much we both admire her and her work. If tonight you could have a dinner with Susan Cutter in light of your dissertation, what would you discuss with her and why?
I would thank her. I would probably do more listening than asking questions. I feel like people in the field like Susan Cutter through the years have really contributed a great deal to the field, and I would be almost intimidated to ask a question. But when I eventually worked up the question later in the evening, I might ask her about some of these assumptions that she incorporated back in 2003 or the early 2000s when she was starting this work, and what kind of pushback she got from her colleagues and her supervisors, and what made her think about sticking to these assumptions and including them, or sticking to these categories, characterizations of humans and incorporating them into the SOVI model. I think that'd be a really rich conversation to have with her. I'm sure there would be other topics, but professionally, that would be at the top of my list.
I agree. I think what's really interesting, you mentioned earlier, I think in your presentation, these neighborhoods, and I think Susan Cutter was one of the first to bring up this concept of place-based vulnerability.
Indeed.
How do you see that in light of your final chapter?
In light of my final
No,
chapter,
sorry,
chapter
chapter 5, sorry.
Chapter 5, no, that's
Yeah.
fine. I do think it's quite relevant, but I will also say that neighborhoods aren't universal. And this is especially concerning because a lot of the studies that I explored in chapter 5, talking about these disparate outcomes for the sexual and gender minorities of the world, actually only come from the Western world, from Japan, from the great tsunami disaster, or from Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And these are in countries with relatively high indices of social acceptance and legal protections. And there's a data gap regarding the situation in countries with lower indices, which might not have defined place-based neighborhoods, but instead underground networks of people. I'm thinking of communities in Bangladesh, which I also explored in the book. So I will firmly defend place-based approaches, but we need to think of other approaches, especially when we're considering marginalized communities.
Thanks. I've reached my questions, Mr. Rector.
Do you have any other questions, or shall I give another opponent the opportunity to ask a question?
I think I can ask one more question, and then I want to
Yeah.
bridge it to the nature-based solutions to chapter 4, if that's okay. How might we better capture the equity impacts of the benefits of nature-based solutions?
Equity in terms of social equity.
Exactly, social equity.
This was an interesting part of the paper. Essentially, it came out of a literature review process with 4 major themes. And one of these really involved community involvement and local knowledge. There were a couple of really interesting examples out of sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia that I would love to refer everybody in the audience to read to. I think this is something that really has a leverage point, especially when we're talking about rural communities having been excluded largely from these disaster risk reduction efforts. It's really encouraging to see these winning stories. And I would only encourage my colleagues who are continuing this work to continue going into the field, working with communities and finding these success stories, because we need these to be documented scientifically before we can make recommendations to policymakers.
I think that's an interesting point, because something that stood out to me in chapter 4 is that some cases showed nature-based solutions imposed without community involvement. And from a risk dynamics perspective, does this lack of participation create some form of social residual risk, or even maybe a physical risk that's not accounted for?
I definitely think so. I think if you don't involve a community in a solution-making process, bringing stakeholders, state and non-state actors to the table and discussing not only the benefits, but also the inherent risks with certain solutions and how they operate and how they don't operate. If you completely bypass that process, that is a huge risk that you're exposing communities to. And if you're looking at rural coastal communities, as I explored, then it really could result in a situation where you are limited in your institutional capabilities of responding in the moment of a disaster. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now that my defense has ended, I sincerely thank the opponents for the attention they have devoted to my thesis. I now look forward to the decision of the doctorate committee, which will decide whether the degree of Doctor of Philosophy will be granted to me.
So I hereby adjourn the public meeting of the Doctoral Examination Committee of the Faculty of Science for further deliberations. Please be seated. So I reopen the public session. By its duly accorded authority, the Doctoral Examination Committee of the Faculty of Science grants the degree of Doctor to Eric Scott Mortensen. I invite the supervisors and co-supervisors to place their signatures to the degree certificate as witness of this deed. Whereafter Professor Philip Ward, appointed by the College of Deans as supervisor, will perform the investiture. And I declare in public that in the privacy of the closed session, the candidate by a signature stated adherence to the conditions laid down in the provisions in Article 5 of the doctoral regulations of this university regarding rights and responsibilities in society and science. So I now request Professor Philip Ward to resume the ceremony, and only the Doctoral Examination Committee stands during the pronouncements of the investiture formula.
By the virtue of the authority vested in me by the management regulations of the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam and the supervisor appointed thereto by the College of Deans, I hereby confer on you, Eric Scott Mortensen, the degree of Doctor of Philosophy, together with all rights, privileges, and responsibilities thereto appertaining. In witness thereof, the seal of the university and signatures of the rector and the supervisors have been affixed to the diploma that you are about to receive. Congratulations.
So Professor Ward will also continue with the laudatio. Thank you. No problem.
Yeah.
Yes.
On brand.
Dear Dr. Mortensen, dear Eric, a huge congratulations on this amazing achievement. Life is like a box of chocolates, a very well-known saying, or in the case of Eric's PhD, a box of pizza. Of course, and I think that this well-known saying fits your PhD journey very well. Let me explain. According to the all-knowing AI, the metaphor has 4 important aspects. Firstly, it is about unpredictability. And it's probably quite unpredictable that I'm here reading this laudatio in this very formal setting from a pizza box. Well, around the middle of your PhD, after completing the first 2 papers that we discussed today on global flood risk modeling using GloFRIS, it became quite clear that you also wanted to take a different direction within your PhD and also branch out from this global modeling. So while out for a bite to eat with your supervisors, suddenly the ideas all started flowing, quite a lot of excitement about new avenues you could go into. And as we had no paper at hand, the only thing to write on was a takeaway pizza box, which you filled with notes inside, on the edge, on the back, and the front. I hope you still have it, by the way. This became quite a nice tradition, the pizza box meeting, which became quite a standard part of your supervision agenda also. But also the start of your PhD was quite unpredictable. So you arrived in March 2020, all excited to be starting your new life in Amsterdam. And we planned to have our first meeting the next week, but the universe had very different plans. We entered the first COVID lockdown. And in the end, I don't think we actually met for about 3 months at all, except for online. And I remember in one of those many Zoom meetings we had that we actually joked that we might never see each other until the end of your PhD. Luckily, we did. But of course, that was a very challenging time to start any PhD. And this relates to the second aspect of the metaphor, embracing the moment. And this is something which I really recognize in you. So I think that when we did finally meet in the summer of 2020, as lockdowns were lifted, I was actually amazed to see that you probably knew more people at IVM than I did after 20 years. So I thought, it'll have been sitting at home and won't know anybody. But this is really a testament to your personality, right? You're very, very open to new colleagues, to new experiences, new people. And also, you're always very happy to help out your colleagues. And I see this I'm going to put this down. And I also see this in your dedication to teaching. But don't take my word for it. I also found a very nice student evaluation from the water risk course that we talked together, and I'll quote it. The enthusiasm and involvement of the teachers has been contagious throughout the first weeks, and the willingness to go the extra mile is very much appreciated. I think the flood part was overall one of the nicest things that I have done during my entire time as a student. I hope that Eric will stay at the VU for a long time. Can't get much better. A third aspect of the metaphor is the variety of experiences. Each piece of pizza, is unique. And similarly, each day and experience in life is different. And I think this also applies to your research, right? So you started off on this very nice GloFRIS model with a project with PBL, Wageningen University, Utrecht University, Deltares, Klingendahl, and others. And it wasn't easy. You had to learn the code of the model. You had to try to figure out where your work fit into this very big project. You had to navigate constantly changing deadlines and expectations. But you did this really well and produced 2 very nice papers that advanced this field of global flood risk modeling. But after a few years, it was clear you really wanted a shift in focus, a change in flavor, to be able to motivate to continue for that final phase of the PhD. And I want to talk about how you did this in a really amazing way. So very independently, with the help of several pizza box meetings, you came up with 2 really interesting papers which took you away from that global modeling into 2 very new avenues. And we talked about them today. Firstly, the nature-based solutions for flood risks and how they can be implemented in small coastal communities. And with this paper, I think you really started to explore these equity aspects of flood risk. And I think that this really awakened an interest and a passion in you to try to bridge your interest for flooding with your passion for diversity and inclusion. And within our meeting, people talked about this passion that you can see in your eyes for these topics. And this led to the final paper on moving towards a more inclusive understanding of disaster risk reduction, which I think is a really wonderful paper showing the importance of including sexual and gender minorities perspectives in risk analyses. And I think it's a great contribution to the field, and I was very happy to share it with colleagues at the recent United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Conference in Geneva, where it was very well received. A final meaning of the metaphor relates to acceptance and appreciation. So the phrase suggests accepting uncertainty of life and finding beauty and value in a journey despite not knowing the outcome. And I think that when you started, you may have had quite a different expectation of the PhD journey. In your acknowledgements, you talk about the journey not being linear. But I think that the journey is all the richer for the various deviations. Because next to the important science advances that you've made during your PhD, you did many other things. I'll just briefly name a few. Starting the IVM GeoGuessr tournament, combining your love of social activities and maps with being known as a very caring friend and colleague with your fellow PhDs. So many of them mentioned to me while I was preparing the speech how wonderfully you cooked for your PhDs during visits to EGU in Vienna, for example. Also, you had personal heartbreaks and difficulties that you dealt with throughout the course of the PhD. And also through that, though, you showed your strength and compassion as a person. And in the final months, you worked on a consultancy project for the World Bank in which your research was used in a flagship report on the global costs of adaptation, really testament to the work you've been doing. So Eric, in summary, it's been a pleasure and an honor to work with you and with the other supervisors as a team. I'm very curious and excited to see what your future will hold. In keeping with the Life is Like a Box of Chocolates theme, I heard from Tone and Timothy that your current project is making a book about hot dogs in Iceland. And that last week you spent herding sheep also in Iceland. If this isn't a testament to your diverse skill set and interests, I really don't know what is. So please enjoy this day, be proud of your achievement, just as we all are. Congratulations again.
So to the congratulations of the supervisor, I gladly add the congratulations of the Council of Deans of this university. Your thesis on flood risk assessments that devote special attentions to social vulnerability and nature-based solutions provides important insights for the management of flood risk and has a high scientific as well as societal value. So this doctoral examination ceremony is now completed. Dr. Mortensen will now lead the procession out of this hall, and I invite you all to follow. So we have the opportunity to congratulate the young doctor at the statue here outside of this hall of Abraham Kuyper, the founder of this university. And there's also a reception that will take place in het Schuifje in Den Koele Blonde, which is room R546 in the WM building. So someone will know the way, and you can follow that person to further celebrate this big achievement. So then I ask you all to stand now. So I close this public session of the Doctoral Examination Committee of the Faculty of Science. May your search for truth and wisdom be of service to the flourishing of the world and humankind.